If we profess a kinship to the art of primitive men, it is because the feelings they expressed have a particular pertinence today. In times of violence, personal predilections for the niceties of color and form seem irrelevant. All primitive expression reveals the constant awareness of powerful forces, the immediate presence of terror and fear, a recognition and acceptance of the brutality of the natural world as well as the eternal insecurity of life. That these feelings are being experienced by many people throughout the world today is an unfortunate fact, and to us an art that glosses over or evades these feelings is superficial or meaningless. That is why we insist on subject matter, a subject matter that embraces these feelings and permits them to be expressed. In fact, Gottlieb believed in the universality of imagery, that some individuals would find meaning in the images he set down, and that meaning ultimately was a conversation between the work of art and the individual viewer that transcended time and culture. Here again is another change in the way an artist approaches abstraction. Gottlieb is not looking for a mass or popular audience. His paintings are made by an individual and intended to be viewed by individuals, with each contributing to the meaning of the work of art. He was significantly rejecting the appeal to a mass audience that was promoted in the 1930s. 1956 was another crucial year for Gottlieb, during which he reached again for different images to reflect his times. He was headed for a radically pared-down image that by the end of the year became the image people have called bursts, and the image most people associate with Gottlieb is this particular painting titled Blast 1 of 1957. That's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. This image, the vertical format with a disc in the top half and a rough, flattened form in the lower half, was one that caught Gottlieb's imagination as well. But Blast 1 doesn't define this type of image or the uses Gottlieb would make of it. He was invested in exploring the limits of his ability to express himself. As he put it in a 1956 interview, "What's going into it is what I'm looking for when I'm doing the painting, those things which I don't know. In other words, I'm feeling my way, and then I find something. And there, to my surprise, is something that wasn't in the world before, and this can become more and more refined and subtle. If I start out with something which is absolutely new to me, I've never done anything like it before, this is a kind of breakthrough. Then I develop it. Then I begin to get nuances. Then I'm interested in finding out how far I can go with this without exhausting it. What are the possibilities of exploring in this territory?" Once Gottlieb found the burst image, he spent the next 2.5 years exploring it, painting only this type of image. And we've been seeing a few of the 50 or so that he painted between 1957 and 1959. As you can see, he covered quite a bit of territory. The major change in his art was that he reduced his imagery to a bare minimum while not extending into the form called minimalism that was being developed at that time. And for comparison, I want to look at a couple of examples of what two of Gottlieb's closest colleagues were doing in the late 1950s. Mark Rothko pursued similar goals to Gottlieb's, but he wanted the viewer to enter the mystical, emotional sphere of the painting. He sometimes spoke of his paintings as religious experience or tragedy, capital T. Barnett Newman spoke in terms of the sublime and the absolute. He once said the artist's function was exploring the world of ideas, not the world of the senses. Newman was the most minimal painter among his colleagues and often is credited as the developer of minimalism. But Gottlieb's humanism had less lofty aspirations than Newman's, and Gottlieb viewed the world as complex and not reducible to absolutes. The lived life wasn't always clear. One needed a direction, but choosing a direction didn't free a person from emotional pulls in a different or opposite direction. Gottlieb also valued the craft aspect of his art. It was important to him that each object he made was obviously made by his hand. Yet he did observe his colleagues' art, and it must have had an impact on him, especially in terms of reducing the imagery on his canvases. So after his 2.5-year exploration of the dual image format that we call bursts, Gottlieb returned to the horizontal imaginary landscape format, but it too had become very pared down. By 1960, which is the date of this painting, his paintings had become, in the words of curator Martin Friedman, a double or nothing proposition. His paintings were visually simpler than before, but he clearly didn't want the reduced means used by Newman and Rothko or other colleagues like Reinhardt or Still. What he probably saw in his colleagues' art was the challenge to produce emotionally complex paintings through the use of fewer, more closely defined images. He elaborated on his goals to Friedman in 1962. If I were asked to say what I mean by feeling, I would say feeling is everything that I've experienced and thought. It isn't purely just feeling in the emotional sense, in the sense of feeling joy or grief or any specific emotion. It's really an attempt to express abstractly almost all my experience, which is emotional. And at the same time, I attach a great deal of importance to the thought process and a kind of intellectual approach to painting. And I can't separate them, because the whole effort of my work is to make a synthesis of all these things. In other words, to get a totality of my experience, which is emotional, irrational, and also thoughtful. So let me go back to Blast 1 for just a minute. And to give you another insight into Gottlieb's art, I've got a short excerpt from a 30-page essay by philosopher Finley Eversole, just about this one painting. I could read a whole thing about spirit. Eversole speaks about this image as primal, felt not consciously but viscerally and intuitively. Its meaning and power emerged through the simplicity of its abstraction as an image devoid of historical and cultural context. In Gottlieb's art, the fundamental ambiguity and ambivalence of existence resolves itself into a conscious dialectic. All pairs of opposites, light and darkness, male and female, love and hate, pleasure and pain, sacred and profane, are at first interfused in the depths of the psyche and do not possess the antithetical character or the degree of separation we imagine. It is only as consciousness dawns that man is able to distinguish the multitude of opposites which make up his world. That's a small part of one person's view of one painting. Gottlieb went on to paint many more, and I'll show just a few examples to give a sense of the range of his art. Starting in 1962 with 2 discs, to the 12-foot tall painting 1, 2, 3 of the next year, to a painting titled 2 Bars of 1968. And one thing that jumps out is Gottlieb's use of color has become exaggerated as the forms within his canvases become simpler. He spoke of color having to carry more of the burden of conveying emotional character of his art. Next image is 3 discs on chrome ground of 1969, and then 5 blue lines of 1970. And in Gottlieb's later work, you may have noticed that the titles become more descriptive. Works from the 1950s have titles like Levitation, Positive, Expanding, Burst. In a sense, he was doing the same thing with his titles that he was doing with his paintings, supplying less detail in order to give the viewer incentive to delve more deeply into his art. In 1968 really was the height of Gottlieb's career. His art was the subject of an exhibition that filled both the Whitney and Guggenheim museums in New York, and he had achieved success that he couldn't have dreamed of when he started out as a young artist with no prospects in the early 1920s. Late in 1970, Gottlieb suffered a stroke that left him paralyzed except for the use of one arm, and he continued his painting with, it seems to me, the sense that his time was limited. His output in his last 3.5 years was greater than the previous 5, even though his energy was greatly reduced. This painting, titled Triptych, is from 1971. It's 22 feet long. It's the largest painting of his career, and it's the first painting he painted on coming out of hospital after a stroke. In a review of Gottlieb's last exhibition during his lifetime in 1972, critic Thomas Hess compared the artist's focus to, quote, that extraordinary ingathering concentration that you glimpse in the eyes of a tennis player in close-up at match point as he walks back to the service line. That's not a description one would ordinarily give to an obviously ill man in a wheelchair, but it was exactly right. Hess also offered his opinion that the subject of Gottlieb's paintings was the symbol of the primal act of creation. That, of course, is exactly the conclusion that Eversole draws, although Hess wasn't aware of the philosopher's work on Gottlieb. So this raises another question about Gottlieb's notion of abstraction. If the goal was to present the primal act of creation, how important was the artist's creative act? Gottlieb defined abstraction in these terms. The very nature of abstraction, the very nature of abstract thought, is to reduce the complexity of all life and to bring it down to something very simple which embodies all this complexity. It's a statement that's always impressed me, especially the reference to embodiment. Painting for Gottlieb and most of his colleagues was the most personal of pursuits. The process of making their paintings was an integral part of the resulting work of art, and in some cases, certainly in Gottlieb's case, helps to define the art object. When these paintings succeed, they embody, as Gottlieb said, a totality of the artist's experience. So that in paintings like Rising of 1972, Gottlieb places the forms he has used for some time, the discs above and the calligraphy below, as clear, easily identifiable gestures. These have become, in one sense, his signature. Yet part of that signature, the calligraphic elements in very thinned down paint, are a kind of ghost image. This may be Gottlieb reflecting on his declining health. The individual is fading. But that gesture is countered by the sprays of paint that are the artist reaching as far as his limited arm motion would allow, at the same time as he uses the paint to extend his reach even further on the canvas. Aspiration is still part of his experience. Finally, the thick black gestures anchor the lower part of the painting, and while the grand motion of the gestures is upwards, the title is Rising, Gottlieb has organized the paint so that the drips from the heavy black calligraphy move down to the lower edge of the surface, while the drips from the disc form above move toward the upper edge. Maybe the double or nothing proposition that Friedman noted in 1962 has become a quintuple or nothing towards the end of Gottlieb's career. But regardless of that, the energy and involvement of the artist and his focus on what is real for him in the moment are what keeps both him and his art vital. In his last few years, Gottlieb created two kinds of painting. Some were quite active, like Rising. Others were very controlled, like Blue Brown of 1973. Here the artist is more intellectual, using his keen sense of color to dictate some of the conflicts within the painting. But complexity is still present in the horizontal bars of differing length and color, opposed by the disc shape that's knifed onto the painting so that it's a physical object with irregular edges, while every other part of the composition is flat, even receding, with perfectly defined shapes. In other words, even within this ethereal world of measureless colors, there is an obstinate physical presence that imposes itself. It's part of the painting while being at the same time something apart from the majority of the painting. The combinations of types of images and ways of applying paint create a tenuous balance. Gottlieb referred to this approach, calling it a kind of sense of structure and order and a thoughtful approach rather than an impetuous approach. In another statement, he offered this: "Since I eliminated almost everything from my painting except a few colors and perhaps 2 or 3 shapes, I feel a necessity for making the particular colors that I use, or the particular shapes, carry the burden of everything that I want to express, and all has to be concentrated within these few elements. Therefore, the color has to carry the burden of this effort." It seems to me that in his last few years, Gottlieb leaned more heavily on his very personal sense of color. He was always a great colorist. In fact, he intended to be a great colorist. But the control he can bring and the ease that he displays in composing very different kinds of images is quite impressive. One other point. He doesn't let go of the history of Western painting. It's always a part of his language. This 1973 painting presents just 3 distinct shapes posed on a raw linen field. The shapes are specific, and a raw canvas is the starting point for every modern painter. The clear reference here is to the beginnings of abstract painting and to this specific painting by Kazimir Malevich from 1915, which is one of the key images of abstract 20th century painting. Like the format of his imaginary landscapes and his reliance on traditional Western paint-on-canvas media, the structure of Western painting was an integral part of who Gottlieb was. So it plays an important role in his paintings. In this case, Gottlieb personalizes, reimagines, and reinvigorates the earlier iconic image. As I mentioned earlier, the paintings of Gottlieb's last years go back and forth between those which are very controlled and others like this painting of 1973, in which the artist uses his physical abilities to manipulate paint and images. Even more than in Rising, the shadow forms coexist with the very physical discs and drips. Once again, it is the act of painting, the reality of our time, here the moment-to-moment physical reality, that creates the drama that engages us. Even in his most pared-down paintings, Gottlieb's reliance on a few basic shapes is persuasive. By this point in his life, and this is painted in his last year, he certainly was aware that the red and black forms on a white ground were self-referential. He still has the ability to make these forms work emotionally, and I want to cite my friend Ebersole one more time. In Gottlieb's art, the fundamental ambiguity and ambivalence of existence resolves itself into a conscious dialectic. If Rothko's dialectic is implicit in his mysticism, Gottlieb's is explicit and imagistic, transcending the logic of ambiguity. Gottlieb's dialectic sets up an open interaction in consciousness between those forces which, in the unconscious, exist on an amorphous and ambiguous relationship with each other. It's again a large thought for a seemingly simple painting. But curiously, Ebersole's observation isn't too far from something Gottlieb said about 20 years earlier. Speaking about his state of mind during the act of painting, Gottlieb related, "I'm not in a position to analyze and be introspective and to view myself in an objective way. I have to let my feelings go, and it's only afterwards that I become aware of what my feelings really were. And for me, this is one of the fascinations and great experiences of painting, that I become aware of myself, and that in the process of painting, I become more aware as a person." I'm going to leave it at that, say thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions about